Hello class, this is CSE-4400, Section 1, Week 15, Fall 2025. Chances you are in the stage where you are making your final push to make your game as perfect as it can be. So Chapter 15 is all about game balancing, so let's quickly talk about that. So, how do we make a balanced game? Well, to be enjoyable, it must not be too hard, it must not be too easy, and it must be fair for competing players. When it comes to making a game that is balanced, there are two major issues that are fairness and difficulty. Though fairness has more to do with player versus player games and player versus environment games. In the most general sense, a balanced game is fair to the players, isn't too easy or too hard, and it makes players' skill the most important factor in determining the player's success. In practice, there are several game features that combine to produce such qualities, and game balancing refers to a collection of design and tuning processes that create those balanced qualities. What makes a balanced game will depend on whether your game is player versus player or player versus environment, but generally, the game should provide meaningful choices, and the role of chance is not so great that player skill becomes irrelevant. There are some qualities specific for player versus player games. Basically, that is, if a player falls behind early on in the game, there is a reasonable opportunity for that player to catch up later in the game. The definition of early in the game and reasonable opportunity may vary based on what your game is and how long it's meant to last. Also, the game must seldom end in a stalemate, and the game must be perceived to be fair by the players. For player versus environment games, the game must be perceived to be fair by the player, and the difficulty of the game must be consistent. Alright, so when it comes to games, you have strategies, but sometimes there are some strategies that are so good that it makes all other choices irrelevant. We call those dominant strategies. So, in game design, this is something that we want to avoid, because it makes the game less fun, because if there is one strategy that works like nearly all the time, what is the point in trying to do a lesser strategy? Dominant strategies are considered undesirable because, as I said, once they're found, there's no use to using any other strategy. It makes all other choices pointless, and it may limit the fun a player may have. So, dominant strategies in video games, there are ways to avoid that, and the easiest way is to introduce what's called an intransitive relationship among players. If strategy B is better than strategy A, and said strategy C is better than strategy B, by the transitive property, strategy C is better than strategy A. So players will likely gravitate towards strategy C. But what if strategy A is better than strategy C? It's a loop. So if strategy B is better than strategy A, and strategy C is better than strategy B, but strategy A is better than strategy C, then somehow strategy A is better than itself, which is a contradiction. Ladies and gentlemen, intransitivity. And the easiest, and probably the most common example of an intransitive relationship is rock, paper, scissors. Rock is beaten by paper, paper is beaten by scissors, scissors is beaten by rock. But no one of those is better than the other. It just has a specific weakness and a specific advantage. You want to know what also follows rules that are not unlike rock, paper, scissors? Pokemon. So, grass is beaten by fire, fire is beaten by water, water is beaten by grass. There are a few other special rules specific to Pokemon in regarding those three types. If you try to go the other way around, you have attacks that are ineffective, and if a type tries to beat itself, it's also ineffective. So yeah, if we're talking about type advantages, Pokemon is a huge mess of graph theory, basically. And a lot of it is, yeah, a lot of Pokemon, or at least when it comes to Pokemon strategies, it's basically graph theory and looking at matrices that is basically what type beats what other type. Also complicated by the fact that Pokemon can have up to 2 types. So you have like 170 some odd possible combinations of types. So yeah, that is one way to make a game more interesting by introducing intransitive relationships where one type is better than the other, but it's beaten by another type. There's another way. It goes by an overly complicated name called orthogonal unit differentiation, but the idea is simple. If you have a strategy game, for example, you might have different unit types. Say you have, so better example, say it's a tower defense game. You have one tower that shoots arrows, and then you have another tower that shoots cannonballs. The cannonballs fire way slower than the arrows, but they deal splash damage. The arrows shoot faster, but they also have a larger range compared to the cannonball tower. Basically, each of your units have different strengths and different weaknesses, and strategy comes from using those different units effectively to try to win in a video game challenge. For PvE games, most games offer many challenges, but few actions needed to overcome them. This encourages the player to find a specific combination of actions to overcome a particular challenge. Thing is, if one action can overcome several types of challenges, you risk creating an exploit, a action so powerful that the player becomes unstoppable. And there's no way to prevent these kinds of issues other than playtesting. Sometimes you might want to integrate the element of chance in a game. But what role does chance play in a game? Well, it depends on what kind of game you are going for, but there are a few recommendations. If you're using chance as part of a combat system, use chance sparingly so that it plays a small role in how the player's actions lead to victory. If chance plays a larger role, then use chance in frequent challenges with small risks and rewards, rather than in infrequent challenges with larger risks and rewards. Allow the player to use the odds in their advantage, and also allow the player to decide how much risk to take. Typically, when you have the element of chance in a game, and I don't mean like gambling games, I mean special effects that have a specific % chance of happening, for example, or certain loot that has a specific % of dropping, those are places where you might want to introduce the element of chance. If you have a game where you have a weapon and it has a % chance of dealing double damage, sure, that's nice and all, but you can't rely on just that to beat a boss. You gotta use other strategies to help beat this boss. You know? A PvP game is considered fair if the players believe the rules give each player an equal chance of winning, and the rules don't give advantages or disadvantages to players unequally during the game in a way that they cannot influence or prevent apart from chance. The easiest way to make a game fair is to make a game symmetric, where the players have the same starting point and the same goal. It's a little bit tricky with an asymmetric game because the players play by different rules to achieve different goals. Specifically for MMOs, basically these are referred to as persistent worlds in the text. Persistent worlds are multiplayer online games that run continuously even if the players aren't logged in. So, MMOs are a good example of this. Such games are inherently unbalanced because the long-time players will have accumulated a significant amount of resources and experience. These kinds of games must provide protection and encouragement to new players. They also can't be zero-sum games. New resources must constantly flow into the game for new players to find. There are some strategies to make a PvE game fair. Again, this is player versus environment. The game should offer the player challenges at a consistent level of difficulty, with no sudden spikes in difficulty. The player should not suddenly lose the game without warning and through no fault of their own. Basically, no learn by dying. A stalemate should not occur. The game does not ask the player to make critical decisions without inadequate information. All factual knowledge required to win a game should be contained within the game, but this does not apply to trivia games. If you're talking about a trivia game that's based on in-game knowledge, all that information should be somewhere in the game. And the game should not require the player to meet challenges not normally presented within the game's genre, unless it's a hybrid genre. So how do we manage difficulty? Well, if you graph difficulty in player ability, there is this sweet spot known as the flow state, where the player's ability is equally matched by the difficulty of a task, and this flow state is basically where people find peak productivity in anything really, and this extends to video games as well. If the player's ability is too high for the difficulty, that's boredom. But if it's the inverse relationship, where the player's ability is too low for the difficulty, that's anxiety. Flow is achieved when the player's ability is roughly matched by a game's difficulty. Balance a game in this way, and you have players entering this flow state. When it comes to difficulty, players care more about perceived difficulty. How hard does a challenge look to a player? And there are 4 factors that affect perceived difficulty: intrinsic skill required, stress, in-game experience, and power provided. Absolute difficulty is the intrinsic skill needed and the stress of a challenge compared to the trivial case. What's a trivial case? Imagine a boss battle, but you turned off the boss's AI, and basically you have turned this boss into basically a DPS dummy. This is the trivial case. The absolute difficulty of a challenge is intrinsic skill needed to defeat this unmoving, cannot react boss. Let me back up. Absolute difficulty of a challenge is the intrinsic skill needed and the stress of the challenge compared to the trivial case. So, boss battle as normal, but you're comparing it to the same boss battle, but the boss's AI is turned off. So a trivial enemy is basically one that cannot move, cannot attack, and can be killed in, I suppose, one hit. If another enemy can fight back, has armor, and is about to press a button that'll drop a piano on your head, then we say that this enemy is more difficult than the trivial enemy. So this is absolute difficulty. How much skill is required, and how much stress do you have in trying to surmount a challenge compared to a trivial case? Power provided is how much power the game gives the player to meet a challenge. And this can be in the form of anything like armor, weapons, enchantments on those aforementioned items. It can also be in the form of player health, army size, performance characteristics of a race car. Relative difficulty is the difficulty of a challenge relative to the player's power to meet that challenge. Finally, as a player continues playing a game, that player gains in-game experience. Not experience as defined by a game's experience system, but experience with playing the game itself. The more experienced a player becomes with playing a game, the more knowledgeable that they become with surmounting a game's challenge. That means as time goes on, players get better at playing the game. And all these factors come together in making a difficulty progression. Relative power is relative difficulty, I should say. Relative difficulty is absolute difficulty minus power provided to meet the challenges of a game. perceived difficulty is relative difficulty minus the player's in-game experience. A game is balanced if the perceived difficulty of a game either does not change or ever so rises gradually. So, say you have a video game and you see this big intimidating boss. You say to yourself, screw that, and then you go off and do a few side quests. But after doing so, you eventually have to surmount this challenge of beating this one boss, and then you realize in doing all the side quests, you are powerful enough to meet this boss. We say that your game has given you power to meet this challenge, and your perceived difficulty of this boss has fallen. So, you see this boss for the first time, you think to yourself, there's no way I'm gonna beat this boss. You go off to a few side quests, and it empowered you enough to finally defeat this boss. We say that the game has given you power to meet the challenge. If this is a skilled player coming back to play the same game again, they might have an easier time beating the same boss, even without having to go do the side quests first. Establishing difficulty modes. Typically, your many games are going to have different difficulty levels, such as easy, medium, or hard, or whatever labels you might want to assign for your game. Some games have a very hard, and some games will go even harder than that. Multiplayer games don't always have difficulty modes because the player's skill determines how hard it is for others to beat that player, unless it's multiple players against the same environment, such as a road race. It's generally a good idea to provide difficulty modes because you allow the player to set the difficulty of the game themselves on account of two other factors that you don't know: the player's previous experience with similar games and the player's native talent. Newcomers might want to play an easy game because they just want to learn how the game works and they don't want to be discouraged by a challenge that is overly difficult. An experienced player might want to play the same game, but harder because they already know how the game works. They might be able to tolerate and succeed at a harder challenge. The next slide is all about positive feedback, and I don't mean like feedback in the form of, hey, your game is great. I mean positive feedback as part of a positive feedback loop. Positive feedback occurs when a player's achievements causes changes to the state of a game that makes subsequent achievements easier, which makes further achievements easier still, and so on. And this is a phenomenon of the core mechanics. You surmount a challenge, which rewards you with things that make it easier to surmount the next challenge. That rewards you with things that make it even easier to surmount the next challenge after that. That's basically a positive feedback loop. What this does is it discourages stalemates and it rewards success and provides a useful reward. What you don't want to do is to have this become a runaway feedback loop. Don't let this go out of control, or the game may end too soon. Or if this is the case with a multiplayer game, lagging players may never catch up. There are several ways to control the rate of positive feedback here. Don't provide too much power as a reward for success. Artificially limit the player's power. Associate costs as well as benefits with the player's achievements. Raise the absolute difficulty as the game progresses. Allow collusion against the leader. Basically, other players can collaborate against the player in the lead. I believe this is using the blue shell in Mario Kart, I believe. Define victory in terms unrelated to the feedback cycle and use the effects of chance to reduce the size of the player's rewards. So here's an example of positive feedback between two players A and B. So 2 through 6 are more interesting. So in case number 2, this is just a game where B had no chance of ever winning. Scenario 3 is where players A and B the lead goes back and forth, but no one player has a sufficient lead over the other. Scenario 4, those are balanced rules, but feedback operates way too fast. Player A gets way too much positive feedback early in the game, and the game ends too fast, and B never has a chance to catch up. Scenario 5, wild swings in the lead produced by powerful negative feedback. And Scenario 6, that's the ideal condition where the lead changes hands multiple times, but at some point, one player of the two gets the lead eventually towards the end of the game, and we can safely declare a winner. Here, basically, ideal game progression, both players exchange hands in who's in the lead. Eventually, one ekes out a victory over the other. When it comes to making tweaks to your game to make your game fair, modify one parameter at a time. If you change more than one parameter at once and something changes, you won't know what you just changed. When modifying parameters, try making big adjustments, not small ones. And of course, keep records of what you have changed. If you have to go so far as to write your changes in a spreadsheet, I say go for it. You gotta document your changes, and eventually you're gonna have to figure out which values produce the best results. And if this is for different difficulty modes, you're gonna need to write several sets of values. Okay? Alright, so that is Chapter 15 on how to make a balanced game. I'm gonna switch over to Chapter 16, which is something I wanted to discuss earlier on, but did not get a chance to do so. Right here. So Chapter 16 is all about level design. That's the process of constructing the experience that will be offered directly to the game using the assets provided by the game designer. With dev teams as small as we have in the class, chances are the roles of game designer and lead level designer are going to be the same people. And if it's a single person dev team, it really is the same two people. Level designers create the following things: the space in which the game takes place, the initial conditions of the level, including the state of changeable features, the set of challenges the player will face, the termination conditions of the level, whether those conditions be victory or loss, the interplay between gameplay and story, if there is one, and the aesthetics and mood of the level. So, when it comes to level design, there are some universal, I say universal in air quotes, which are meant to be aimed at any game, and then there are some principles that are specific to the genre. Level designers have debated over which principles, if any, can be even considered universal. So what I'm going to talk about here is more brief list of principles that can apply as much to game design as they do with level design. So key design principles: tutorial levels, varying the pacing of the level, and when the player cements a challenge that consumes resources, provide more resources. Avoid anything that doesn't make sense unless it's supposed to make no sense. This includes placing awards and dangers in locations that no sane player would possibly expect to find. That would just discourage players from playing your game any further. Unless it's supposed to be nonsensical. Sometimes breaking design rules is more fun than adhering to them. I can think of one good example, and imagine a platformer game where you have this recessed area in the ground, and you know that area is going to... You know that once the player steps on that recessed area on the ground, that platform is going to pop away and the player falls to the ground. So you jump over that recessed area, thinking it's going to collapse, pop out of the ground, and the player falls down. But no, the ground in front of it pops out and the player falls to the ground. That subverts your expectations. Let me draw what that means. Okay, so imagine you have a platformer game and there's this suspicious looking area that looks like it is recessed from the rest of the ground. You are here. Your expectation is you would jump over this recessed area, but what happens instead is the ground here breaks away, and then you fall to the ground. You see this recessed area and you think to yourself, this is where a trap is. But no, if you get this area to break away instead, you have just subverted your player's expectations, possibly for the better or the worse, depending on your player's level of tolerance for frustrating events like this. If this is a rage game, then this would be intentional game design. So, anything that would not make sense is to be avoided unless it's supposed to not make sense. Also, clearly inform the player of what their short-term goals are to be. At the very least, tell the player what to do next. Also, be clear about risks, rewards, and the consequences of decisions. Learn by dying is generally considered bad game design. Reward the player for skill, imagination, intelligence, and dedication. Rewards for those can be power-ups, resources, shortcuts, secret levels, or even simple praise. Reward in a large way, punish in a small way. The foreground takes precedence over the background. The player is going to be fixated on, for the most part, what's immediately in front of them. A video game boss should have the following purpose: put up a good fight and then lose. The goal is for the player to eventually win. Also, implement multiple difficulty settings if possible. Now we talk about video game level layouts. Not the sequence of levels in the games, but rather how the level is structured so that the player can navigate through a level. First is the open layout. Basically, barely any constraints on the player's movement. The player can move around freely. These kinds of layouts correspond to the outdoors, where the player can wander around in any direction, though depending on the game, you might have some extra movement constraints where the player must unlock a specific mode of moving around before they can unlock that area. There's also the linear layout. Basically, no branching paths. The game is said to be on rails because the route that the player follows is a predetermined path. Parallel layout, basically a linear layout with some variety. Basically a layout in which there's more than one possible path from beginning to end. You might have paths that are shorter but are more riskier to take. That's an example of a parallel layout. Ring layout, basically a racetrack, which may also feature shortcuts. Network layout, a layout in which spaces are connected in a variety of ways, gives more freedom over what paths a player can take. A hub and spoke layout, you have a central hub and then areas in which the player can go to. Maybe this could be for a game where it's not one game, but rather a series of minigames, and the player just wanders to a specific area to play a minigame. The central hub usually has no dangers or a challenge. It's a safe area or a base. It's the spokes that are other regions of the world that the player explores. And then some of these spokes may be unlocked later because that's part of the game progression. Other parts of this area are to be unlocked as the game progresses. And of course, there's the combination of layouts. The art director and lead game designer, or they might be the same people here, decide on the overall look in the game. The artists are the ones who build the models, and the audio engineers are the ones who create the sound effects. It's up to the level designer to assemble all of these assets together to create a level of that creates a specific mood, and it's also aesthetically coherent. Unless it's all the same people for a small dev team, then basically someone has to make all the assets for a game. All the 2D and 3D assets, all the sprites, all the sound effects. They must all harmonize and create a specific mood that the player will then feel. Establishing the atmosphere for a game requires all these different tools: lighting, color palette, weather and atmospheric effects, particles, blood splats, smoke, music, ambient audio, and the like. Progression and pacing. A large video game is almost always going to be divided into multiple levels. If you want your player to experience those levels in a sequence, they should experience some sort of progression. Changes from level to level to represent growth, or narrative advancement, or both. Here's a simple example. Maybe imagine a game where you have to defeat a necromancer who's at the top of a volcano. The game progression could be such that the first level is a forest, and the next level is another forest, and then several levels after that, it's a dead forest, and then several levels after that, it's starting to be a desert, and then towards the final levels, it starts to become volcanic. That can signify progression, how the amount of life in each level gradually decreases. You can also signify progression by making the mobs progressively more difficult. How do games change from level to level? Mike Lopez has identified a few features that should exhibit progression. And of course, one of them is going to be difficulty. That example where I mentioned the necromancer on top of a volcano, and as you progress, the landscape becomes more dead, that's environmental progression. Mechanics, experience duration, other rewards, and practical rewards. The more rewards you get for playing the game, that is also progression. How do you design the progression? Well, the game mechanics should become more rich as the game progresses. Experience duration. Apart from atypical levels, successive levels should generally take longer to play. Ancillary rewards and environmental progression. Ancillary rewards are basically side rewards unrelated to gameplay. Environmental progression refers to how the environment changes as the player progresses, possibly to represent travel. So that example of the necromancer on top of a volcano, and the environment around the player becomes progressively more dead. Practical gameplay rewards. Maybe as this player progresses through this dead landscape, the player picks up better and better armor. And as I said, difficulty, the game becoming more difficult as the game goes on. This is probably the expected way we think of when a game progresses, the game becomes progressively more difficult. Design the pacing. The pacing of your game is going to depend on what your game's genre is. 2D side-scrollers and basically 2D side-scrollers and top-scrolling shooters are among the fastest-paced games out there. I would probably add rhythm games as well. Adventure games are generally much slower pace, but that doesn't mean that adventure games are always slow. Sometimes there's going to be combat scenes where the game feels faster because you need to act faster. As a general principle, you're going to want to vary the pacing between fast and slow periods. This also allows the player to rest, and it also makes the game more balanced. If surmounting a challenge required the player to consume resources, this return to a slow pace allows the player to rest and resupply. Although the pacing of a level may vary, the overall pacing of a level should either remain steady or become more rapid as the player reaches the end, usually culminating in a boss to be defeated at the end of a level. There used to be a time when video games had manuals that came with them. Some games still do have manuals, though they might be in the form of an e-document or maybe a game wiki. These days, many games are designed for the player to just start playing. If there is a manual, it's probably accessible within the game itself, or maybe accessible as a link to the game's wiki. Ideally, you would want the game manual to be accessible within the game so that the player doesn't have to open another application to read the game's instructions. Also, the game should also feature tutorial levels if you're able to provide them. The kinds of things that would teach new players how to play the game. Also, such levels should have the option to be skipped. So yeah, that was a brief overview of chapters 15 and 16. They are a little bit on the short side, but yeah, that's gonna be it for chapters 15 and 16. I will have to make another video on characters and storytelling. Stuff that I wish I would have gotten to a bit earlier. Alright. That's gonna be it for this video, and I'll see you in what's probably going to be the final video for the entire course. Storytelling and character design.